So I don't need to introduce myself, but for those who just joined, like my name is Joshua. I lead the product team at Mantle for the network. So at Mantle, we're currently an optimistic L2 network. Considering, assessing in the works to develop integrations for ZK validity proofs. So we're like in the position where like we're going to bring a large migration to ZK. So definitely, we have no I have no like particular what's the word for it? I have no stake in this fight. I just want the best for my users. So we have two esteemed guests here who is going to be on the cutting edge to debate about the trade-offs between optimistic and ZK rollups. My goal here is really just with this assessment, trying to figure out what's the best for the users. So before I dive into any questions, of course, like there's some ground rules of the debate. We'll start with clear definitions. Of course, we'll have your introductions. We'll start clear definitions on the arguments referring to the same terms. We'll alternate between each person, so hopefully no interruptions between each person. I'll give ample time, right, so that you have answer each and opportunity if there is a criticism on the other party's position. So yeah, before we start, let's do a round of intros. Maybe just the nearest person to me, maybe Ratan, you can introduce yourself and your project.
Yeah, definitely. Hey everybody, I'm Ratan. I'm a founding engineer at Succinct. At Succinct, we're working on SP1, which is the leading ZK VM, or a leading ZK VM, and the Succinct Prover Network, which is a place where you can generate cheap, censorship-resistant proofs. We've been working with Mantle a lot on their recent launch and transition, hopefully, into validity proving. We can talk a little bit about that too.
Cool. I'm Matt. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Caldera. We're best known for our rollups as a service product, so we've helped, at this point, about 100 teams, including 30 who have gone to mainnet, launch their own customizable, dedicated rollups. We are a big fan of ZK, so I'm not like a pure optimistic maxi, but we work with both the top ZK stacks, like the ZK Sync stack, OP Succinct, of course, and the top optimistic stacks, like Optimism and Arbitrum, to help people launch their own chains.
Perfect, perfect. Let's start with like clear definitions. We cannot assume the audience to have the same definition. Maybe Matt, since you take that position that's more optimistic, I know you're still a fan of ZK, but let's say you take that position. What is an optimistic rollup?
Yeah, I mean, at its core, like an optimistic rollup is a rollup where execution happens, quote unquote, optimistically, right? And so what this means is that the rollup executes transactions, it submits state to the L1, right? That's what makes it a rollup. And there's a general assumption that that rollup is operating correctly. That's the optimistic part. And then you have an ability for someone else to submit a fault proof, or AKA a fraud proof, in the case that the rollup isn't working correctly, which is a very rare case. So basically you have a rollup, the rollup doesn't prove its validity at the start. There is a process where someone can prove its lack of validity later on. And through that process, you can then, given enough time, assume that that rollup is valid. Okay,
cool. And maybe, Ratan, you can give us a definition for ZK rollups.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of in the taxonomy, I'd say there's like this transition that's been happening over time. You started with side chains, which had like different security properties than the underlying layer in which the rollups are settling. So this is, I think Polygon POS, among some other chains, fall in this category where you had like a set of validators that were separate from the Ethereum validator set or the validator set, and they signed off. Then you had optimistic rollups where the costs were too expensive to prove up front that the new state was valid, and so you instead had to rely on this mechanism where, okay, we're only going to prove it if someone contests it, and this allows us to move fast and wait for the tech to catch up. ZK is where the tech has caught up, right? So now today, finally, after a long time, after a lot of work by a number of different entities, we finally have a piece of technology that allows us to do upfront proving. ZK VMs allow you to take the normal Rust implementation of, let's say, the Ethereum state transition function, put it inside of a ZK VM, generate cryptographic proof, and hand it up front with the state root to verifiably prove that, hey, this is the new state root. We can settle immediately. So, for optimistic rollups, you need to wait 7 days. With ZK, you can settle as soon as the cryptographic proof is delivered. And so that's a great unlock for a lot of teams. Yeah.
Great, great. And just to clarify, for the sake of debate, like ZK fraud proofs, Is that ZK rollup or not?
Yeah, it's a good question. So basically within the taxonomy, I'd say optimistic rollups, there are many different ways to do your dispute function for optimistic rollups. The one that's implemented today by Arbitrum and Optimism is an optimistic fraud proof. And that optimistic fraud proof requires an on-chain dispute game. So you have a bunch of transactions on-chain to bisect which specific block or instruction you disagree on. With ZK fraud proofs, you can say, okay, we disagree. Let's find the block we disagree on, and then let's generate a ZK proof of the valid transition for only that block. So you don't need to prove the entire range, and we can just settle that. And so that's basically how it divides, right? So with the optimistic game, you end up needing to execute that instruction on chain. There's like different implementations of it, but basically you have like a VM on chain you're actually executing that instruction with. With the ZK fraud proofs, you still generate a cryptographic proof.
I think for the purpose of definition, like for the debate, I'm happy if we consider it ZK. I'm happy if we consider it optimistic. I guess one thing to note though, with a ZK fault proof, you get some really nice properties, right? You get like especially kind of non-interactivity, which is what you're alluding to. But I would say a lot of the benefits that people talk about with ZK rollups, such as like instant settlement with that proof, you don't get in that paradigm with like a ZK fault proof. So maybe I'll leave it to you to let you to decide, because again, it's kind of in between definitionally.
Let's call it an optimistic rollup for now.
Okay, great.
Okay, good. We have clear definitions. So I'm going to start with the categories that I feel like as a chain we value for users. So generally I would say which is more secure, which is better UX, which is more scalable and cheaper in cost. So start with the first one, which is more secure. And we can start with perhaps a definition I would like to steal from ZK, but 2 points, completeness and soundness. So which is more secure? Maybe we'll start with Matt on your side.
Sure. I think this is candidly a very hard question to answer in practice. If I had to shill for optimistic rollups, the thing I would say is that optimistic rollups, as they are right now, are the most battle-tested stacks on the market. Right? Optimism and Arbitrum, those two stacks secure far, like it's like an order of magnitude more value than the top ZK stacks. And as well, when you're thinking about software, there are like the kind of theoretical security properties of that software, which I think ZK does candidly have the advantage on, because again, you have like an instant cryptographic proof that like your thing is acting correctly. But then they're kind of the practical aspects there as well, right? So basically, is there a bug in your ZK VM implementation? These things are very hard to audit, right? We don't have a lot of experience as a space, as an industry, as a society, thinking or reasoning about ZK proofs. They're very new. Like as well, is there a flaw in the proof system? Is there a flaw in the stack itself? Is there a flaw in like the bridge contracts? All of these things can be possible in both optimistic or ZK paradigms. For us, like when we think about these types of things, it's always about just choosing the kind of most battle-tested stack, because you kind of have like the proof is kind of in the pudding. Like if a stack has been around being used for like 3 years and it hasn't been hacked yet, you can kind of have stronger assumptions than a new stack, even if it's using more cutting-edge ZK technology. I think the one other thing I'll mention here as well, just pragmatically, how we're seeing this rollups actually be used. A lot of the times, the rollup proof process is not actually the weakest link for like a majority of assets on the chain. So let's say you have a new rollup that gets spun up where they direct all of their users to bridge into that rollup via Hyperlane or Layer 0 or something like that. Those all, to some extent, that have like their kind of committee models. Maybe they have some sort of ZK model, but it tends to be weaker than the actual proof model of the rollup itself. And so for a lot of chains that come out right now, whether or not they're ZK or optimistic, they have a weaker link somewhere else, when it comes to asset issuance on the chain. And so for a lot of pragmatic purposes, and the way that we see a lot of teams approach this decision, they are not necessarily thinking about it from like a securities first principles perspective. But I don't think I can truly claim that like in the long run, like optimistic rollups are more secure than ZK.
Yeah, I think Matt brings up a couple of really good points here. I think one caveat I will put is are the optimistic rollup stacks really battle tested if you had permission challengers for the last 2.5 years, 3 years? I do agree the systems have been in production for longer, but it's not the 3-year versus 6-month differential that we're kind of describing. I think it's closer to like 1 year, 6 months, or people are thinking about it for a bit longer. I think one really nice part about the validity stacks is that you can, the systems are much easier to reason about. If anyone has ever tried to look at what it actually takes to deploy an optimistic rollup configuration in production, the bond sizes are ridiculous. You're looking at like $10 million, maybe more for some stacks. And I think that's just a non-starter for a lot of smaller chains, or requires you to opt into a larger configuration. With validity stacks, you can configure your security depending to the security properties you want. So like, let's say, for example, you don't trust just having a ZK VM proof. There's a team called Tycho that set up like a multi-prover setup, right? So they had enclave proofs plus ZK VM proofs. This reduces, right, the vulnerabilities that could be associated with a ZK VM bug or a TE bug, right? So you get around it that way. I think when it comes to the bridging side of things, one thing that I think is quite interesting is, so you're probably more familiar with bridging than I am, but there's like the committee-based models, and then there's the across network kind of models where people are just supplying the liquidity and taking on the duration risk of holding the assets. With validity proofs, that duration risk is only an hour instead of 7 days. So you can actually greatly increase the liquidity. And for a lot of teams that are looking to have significant numbers of a significant amount of assets on their rollup, it makes it much more easy to convince teams to actually bridge, because they know that they will always be able to bring their assets back down to the L1 within an hour, which is quite nice. So I think in terms of security, optimistic rollups are more battle tested, but I think you can get the same security with multi-proof setups. And I think in the limit, that's what it looks like. And the cost is coming down to the point where it's actually viable to deploy that. Before it was also a non-starter to say, hey, I'm going to generate 2 proofs because 1 proof alone was too expensive. Now, if the cost comes down significantly, you're fine doing that.
Yeah, are we allowed to kind of like respond or ask further questions?
Of course.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of those things are very true. I guess for multi-prover setup, the question really becomes like, well, what happens when you have a conflict? Like in the happy path where both of these two things agree, that's fine. But then it's not really that useful, right? What happens if your TE proof disagrees with the ZK proof? Who wins?
I mean, this is a good question, but it's better than there being a bug in the ZK system and it getting exploited. If it disagrees, the chain progress stops. I think we take safety over liveness in this case.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Anything else? Okay, I think some of these other categories are somewhat already touched, but I'll just go through it. Maybe there may be more points than what I've anticipated, but which approach do you think has a better user experience for you? From the user's perspective.
I think you have a good perspective on this, probably having deployed many rollups.
Sure. I think for practical purposes, a lot of the UX differences, they come to individual implementation details of the stacks. So it's very hard to categorically say, ZK versus optimistic and make a determination there. I think one area where optimistic rollups definitely win, in the past, right now, and probably for the foreseeable future, is in cost, right? Like an optimistic rollup, you fundamentally, whether you have some on-chain interactive fault proof or some ZK fault proof, that proof only needs to happen in like the very unlikely, unhappy case where like the sequencer is acting maliciously. And so in the general case, that means you are using strictly less computation to run your chain, which means strictly less cost, right? I think Succinct has done a really good job optimizing costs. From my understanding, I took a look at your docs like earlier today. You can tell me this is out of date, but using ZK to do a validity proof on transactions probably adds about half a cent per transaction in cost.
I think it's lower than 1/10 of a cent for some chains.
Lower than 1/10 of a cent for some chains.
Yeah.
Why is it chain dependent?
It's dependent on the amount of computation you're doing in your transaction, right? So if your chain is all transfers versus your chain is all verifying Grot16 proofs, it's a very different amount of cost. One question I will ask to you, because I've thought about this a little bit, is I imagine when you're deploying, let's say like stage 1 rollups with fraud proofs, there's some bond you have to put up. How do you think about comparing the cost of interest that you lose on that bond, right? Like let's say you're putting up $10 million, 4% interest, what is that, like $400,000 a year? is the proving cost of the chain less than that? Like, how do you compare and contrast the ongoing cost of maintaining the bond versus the interest you can earn, like the risk-free rate, versus the proving cost of the chain? Is that like a consideration that teams have? And when you deploy, do you deploy it with a bond or without a bond today?
We generally deploy without a bond. I think our position is that a bond is not necessary. Like, the way that the fault-proof model works, right, in the general case is like you have a whitelisted set of people who can validate the chain, submit fault proofs if they feel like the sequencer is running improperly. That is like a 1 of n honesty assumption. So only one of those parties needs to be honest and live in submitting a transaction in order for a user to generally feel confident that that rollup bridge is secure. And what we found with most of the chains that we're running is that it's sort of like a proof of authority model almost, where like there are enough independent players who are invested in that chain operating correctly that you don't actually need them to stake additional economic interest on that, right? So like when we're running a chain, obviously we will also run our approver because we want to make sure that we're checking ourselves. The team that we're running that chain for will often run one because they want to make sure that we're running things correctly. Oftentimes the stack will run one. Other community members in that chain will run one. And you don't actually need a bond for that system to operate correctly.
And I think in this configuration, optimistic rollups are good because if you have a permission set of proposers or challengers, right, like the validity proof doesn't matter as much, right, because only a certain number of people are able to contest it. I think it is, though, nice if you don't have to maintain a fraud-proof system. That, I think, is the advantage there, is like, oh, if the costs get low enough, now that team doesn't need to maintain like a separate implementation of an on-chain dispute. Instead, they can just put their node code inside of a ZK VM and call it a day, right? And I think that, to me, is where in the limit you'll see those permission configurations transition over to validity. Yeah, that is
sure.
So why do you think so basically if you want permissionless challenging, then you need to have a bond. Is that correct? Or then why do you think why are Optimism and Arbitrum putting up, $10 million, $100 million if they can just rely on this one event trust assumption? Or is it just like different depending on the amount of value secured by your chain?
Yeah, as far as I know, I think the more permissionless you want that system to be, you need some bond because otherwise it kind of can open up a DOS vector, basically. But I think for the vast majority of cases, for a lot of chains, like the you can do this with like a bondless whitelisted process. It works fine. It's sort of similar, I think, in practice to what you mentioned with like a dual prover setup, where if they disagree, you fall back to some multi-sig. A lot of chains, they have a security council or multi-sig, and ultimately like that is kind of like the weak link security-wise. So from our perspective, like for the vast majority of chains, permissionless fault proving is not really necessary. Also, one thing to note, of course, is that like even if you have an optimistic setup, you don't need to wait for one of these permission validators to submit a fault proof in order for you as like a human or as a system to gain confidence that the rollup is operating correctly. Anyone can run a node, at least verify that the rollup is operating correctly. And if it's not, you don't need to interact with that chain. So users do have like a fair amount of ability to participate in the system permissionlessly.
Cool. Matt, any questions for Ratan?
Yeah, I think on this, we're talking about like usability, right?
Yeah.
UX. I'd be curious if there are any huge UX advantages you can see coming from like rollups moving to a ZK model.
Yeah, I think here, well, there are the ones on the infrastructure side, which we talk about, where I think in the limit, it seems pretty clear to me that even the L1 is moving to snarkification, they call it. We'll call it just ZKification of that chain. And what that allows is for no one has to run these intensive nodes anymore. I've tried spinning up rollup nodes myself. No matter how easy you try to make it, it's still somewhat intensive and I think restrictive in terms of who can run it. I've actually, I'll give like a bit of an example. I was trying to run like OP Reth yesterday for a couple of chains, and just like that alternate implementation just doesn't work for some chains. And so I think these kinds of compatibility issues make it difficult for users to validate the chain themselves. And so I think in the same way that the L1 is moving towards having validity proofs every single block, rollups in the end game will also have that. And so instead of having these, the superchain has this configuration where you're going to have like for n chains, every single time you want to generate a fraud proof, you need to be running all n nodes. So you can show all of the interleaving transactions. You have to be aware of all the states of all the different rollups. With validity proofs, you don't have that restriction. So it allows you to scale the rollups significantly more, right? You just need to generate a proof independently for every single one of the rollups. You don't need to run all of the nodes. Once you receive them, you can interleave the transactions and confirm they're correct. So I think on the infra UX side, in the limit, ZK is better. I think on the other side of it, you probably are more aware of this than I am, but I've had friends that are deploying, applications on L2, and people just complain about the 7-day withdrawal time all the time. And no matter how good, layer 0 or across are, there's fundamental limitations towards having liquidity available in the size of like 8 or 9 figures on a rollup, right? Like you're going to end up taking some haircut. And the native bridging is the whole point of the rollup, right? Like we didn't want sidechains so we could have native bridging. And so I think on that front, it's just an incredible unlock, right? You no longer need to be worried about having layer 0 across plug in. And as the validity proving times get closer and closer to the block time, there's no longer going to be a need for, a bridging mechanism from the L1 to the L2.
Okay, so let's go to a much more like speculative topic. Let's go into speculation right here. So what's next for each of these architectures? Anything on the cutting edge there that could potentially make it more interesting in the future? Yeah, we'll start with that. Yeah.
I think one thing that I'm quite excited about is there's this initiative called R55, which allows you to run RISC-V code on top of the EVM. And basically like how it works is you have like specific syscalls that dispatch out to the EVM from that RISC-V code, and that'll allow you to have Rust applications deployed on the EVM, which is I think a big unlock, or any language that could compile down to RISC-V. And I think with the validity proof system, most of them are RISC-V based. If you have dynamic loading of RISC-V programs into that execution of the STF, you can actually get Rust programs with validity proofs on the L2 immediately. I think for fraud-proof systems, it might take a little bit longer to design that nicely. So that's just one advantage where I think I'm quite excited about seeing how that develops. I think the Ithaca team, like Georgios, are making a big effort towards making that happen. Leo, the old lead on the Solidity compiler, is also doing that effort. So yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because the thing I was going to talk about was like ARP stylus, which I know was mentioned like on the last panel, and is basically the optimistic version of what you're talking about, right? But like I think generally we're seeing a lot of interest in like multi VM or alt VM environments and optimistic rollups. Again, if you have a good like general purpose ZK prover, it's not impossible that to do. But what we've seen in practice is like a lot of effort right now is going into being able to prove the canonical EVM, and it seems like a lot of the kind of like alt VM or EVM plus types of development is mostly happening on the optimistic side right now.
I will say there's nothing that stops you from taking that and putting it in a ZK VM. So I think we will see potentially, cool developments on that side where alt VM environments are able to be run fundamentally inside of a VM. But obviously running RISC-V code is going to be better than running WASM code.
Yes. I actually, so I don't want to put you on the spot, so you can choose if this is getting too in the weeds. We can move on from this, but like one thing I'm aware of is like we have like spoken to you guys about potentially seeing if like ZK proofs on ARP stylus is possible, and it seems like right now at the very least it's not a priority. Like what are the major blockers there from making that happen?
I think well, this is getting a little bit in the weeds, I will say, but basically there's some things on the Arbitrum front that would be nice to support. And I think, for example, with Optimism, there's like, it's directly plugged into Reth. So you have a Rust implementation. There's no Rust implementation of Arbitrum.
Right.
So there's additional overhead that's required from like actually getting that WASM. Like, they essentially take their node engine is running WASM code, so you need to take that WASM code and run it in RISC-V or run inside the ZK VM. So I think that effort is going to take some time, but there's nothing fundamentally that stops it. It's all about performance, right? Like fundamentally, this is code that can be compiled nicely into RISC-V. You can run it. Just takes engineering effort to get there. So yeah, I think we're pretty excited by it. I think the Arbitrum team was really early on the alt VM vision, which has been very impressive. Renegade is a team that is building like a dark pool on top of Arbitrum, and it literally wouldn't have been possible for them to deploy their dark pool without having stylus, right? Like the cost just would have been too high for verifying their proofs in the EVM. So I'm really excited to see how we can actually take that and extend the validity from the applications that are deployed in Arbitrum to the actual protocol itself. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I agree with you. Like, it doesn't seem to me like there's anything fundamentally preventing this from happening in a ZK context in the future. I guess the point I would make is like, right, we have this in an optimistic context right now, and not all. I'm a huge fan of Rust. Prior to this job, my last job was 100% coding in Rust, but not everything is in Rust. Not everyone knows how to write Rust.
This is true. But you can compile most things to RISC-V.
That is true.
It's just with enough. I think if a bunch of people came to us and were like, "Hey, we really want to run Go code in RISC-V," okay, then we'd do it. I just will say a lot of the Ethereum community is moving towards using Rust. A lot of it pushed, I think, very well by Georgios and other people. So that's where we are right now. I think long term, if people are wanting to run Go code that way, we'll do that too.
Okay, just probably like a one word and one sentence answer to this very speculative question. By the end of 2025, how much percentage of rollups do you think will be secured by ZK versus optimistic?
Go ahead.
I think
only wrong answers, so it's fine. Yeah.
I think many of the major ones will be. I think for smaller chains, it may take a longer time for adoption. Some of it depends on being able to do alt-DA nicely. We're working pretty closely with like Celestia and EigenDA and AvailDA as well to get them to get the rollups validity proven. I mean, if we're going to go by total value secured, I think that's the more interesting metric. So what does that take? Base, Arbitrum, World, OP mainnet, that gives you what, like 80%, 70% of the total value secured? Maybe a couple of those names fall. Yeah, I think I would go optimistic and say at least 50%.
Okay. I would take the under on 50%. No surprises there. I think especially a lot of these, like right now, the biggest rollups are optimistic. I think by end of 2025, I wouldn't be surprised if, there were, like Succinct was running fault proofs for like OP mainnet and base using ZK fault proofs. I actually would be somewhat surprised if that was like the main proving mechanism, and like there was like, and if those proofs were actually securing that level of value versus being kind of like a sidecar. But you would know better than me about your guys' progress on that front.
Yeah, I think for the ZK fraud proofs, the percentage will be higher, obviously, and I think it'll be in a multi-proof system. I think though we believe strongly that the optimistic systems are much more difficult to maintain, and I think this is pretty evident to anyone that's tried looking at the optimistic systems, there's a lot of entrenched, I don't want to call it tech debt, but a lot of effort that's been put into making the optimistic systems work well. So there will be multi-proof systems in the short term, but I think by end of 2026, definitely, it's going to be mostly ZK fraud proofs, probably validity proofs. Because in the last year, we had literally 100x reduction in cost, right? And I don't imagine we'll have another 100x, but even a similar, even one order of magnitude really gets you in a place where these large rollups are willing to move over. And I think this is going to be in contention with, Base wants to scale to a gigagas, right? If the transaction fees go down significantly, maybe that comes into contention with the proving costs. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Base wanting to scale to gigagas is like slightly bearish for them adopting ZK proofs, right? Directionally.
In some ways, yes. If you imagine that the transaction fee paid per gas goes down, because really what is ZK proving cost? In the same way that DA cost is passed on to users, proving cost is also passed on to users. And so I think if that metric does go down, then yeah, you probably have a more difficult argument to be made.
Okay, this might go on forever. I do want to make sure that the timekeeper is going to kill me. But this has been really, really fun. I see there's actually more similarity than differences, and this is really helpful for me. Once again, let's call it a wrap. Thanks for your attention. Yeah, let's thank these two debaters, and yeah, thank you.
Round of applause for our
Thank you.
panelists, please.